Absent any international mechanism to monitor, mediate, and facilitate negotiations, indigenous nations and states and transnational corporations are left to their own devices. There is a positive example with some limitations to a gas pipeline being transported across indigenous territories in British Columbia and Canada. The indigenous communities and their leadership negotiated an important series of agreements with a series of companies that were organized to build the pipeline, a gas pipeline that would run over the territories of some 20 or so indigenous communities. The agreement did produce a series of good agreements, but as with all negotiations, especially those negotiations that are not mediated and enforced, then it contains some flaws. And one of the flaws in the agreement in British Columbia was and is the fact that the corporations chose to deal with certain political leaders that the Canadian government recognized, which is to say the communities may not have had a process that was internally set up to engage in the negotiations. So what happened was with Canada's decision to say we recognize certain political leaders, the corporation could then simply negotiate with them, as opposed to other leaders, such as elders and traditional leaders, who were excluded from those negotiations. That left a division within the community. The consequences are continuing to this day, and they're negative consequences. It's one of the flaws that could have been prevented had there been a mediating mechanism between that was an international mechanism that had enforcement capabilities and was agreed to by all the parties. But since that didn't exist, the process of free, prior, and informed consent was simply being carried out based on people's best judgments and best hopes. The important other thing about that particular situation is that the various bands, the tribes, First Nations, had relied upon the technical support of some experts that they brought in to the process. That was key because they were then able to rely on a broader base of research and information than if they had only relied on their own internal knowledge in dealing with these corporations and with the government of Canada. The consequence was that there is an agreement. However, it's got flaws that need yet to be remedied. There are a few other free, prior, and informed consent examples, but they are not quite the same in the sense that there were negotiations. In Peru, it was decided some time ago that some indigenous nations in the forest in the eastern part of Peru were being occupied by several transnational corporations that were seeking to exploit oil resources in that territory. The lawsuit was processed, and the judgment was that those corporations had to be removed from the indigenous territory because they did not seek or achieve consent from the indigenous nations. However, some months later, the government changed its policies and essentially ignored the decision of the judge. And so the corporations were allowed to go back in.